Our first speaker we have is Paula Cullenberg, the director of the Alaska Sea Grant Program, and she's going to be talking about the graying of the fleet.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. And yeah, I'm really sorry that I'm not there, and appreciate you giving me a chance to make this presentation by a distance. I'll try not to be too long. I'm going to talk a little bit about a research project that's funded by Alaska Sea Grant and the North Pacific Research Board, and it's called The Graying of the Fleet in Alaska's Fisheries, Defining the Problem and Assessing Alternatives. The PI of this project is Courtney Carruthers, who is a fisheries anthropologist, and the other PIs are myself and Rachel Donkersloot, and Rachel is also an anthropologist, and my role in this study is to talk a little bit about some public policy alternatives, and then we have two graduate students working with us, Jesse Coleman and Danielle Ringer. So what's the issue in our state? A couple of things. One is that the average age of fishing permit holders, and by that I'm talking about salmon permit holders and IFQ halibut quota holders in our state has increased by 10 years since 1980. So the average age of a fisherman in our state who's an owner is about 50 years old right now. So the fishing fleet is aging out, and this is pretty common across the state. And then compounding that is that there has been a sort of an outmigration of fishing permits and quota from coastal communities in Alaska, and that has economic implications for the viability of those coastal communities and fishing communities. So this is a trend that's something to pay attention to and consider ways to respond. And as a result of that, in 2012, the legislature passed a resolution identifying the graying of the fleet as a pressing concern to the state. And so just a couple of graphic slides, you can see this sort of significant downward trend of permit holders that are under the age of 40. And so, for example, that purple line on the top is South Naknek. And back when limited entry began in 1976, there were maybe 25 to 30 permit holders in South Naknek, and now it's down to about 6. And you can see similar trends for some of these other communities. And if you go to the next slide, even some of the larger hub communities, Kodiak, Dillingham, it's been a pretty consistent downward trend of permit holders under the age of 40. The one exception on this graph is Togiak, and Togiak has, for different reasons, I think, has been holding its own. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see at the same time there's a drop in permit ownership from Alaska rural local residents. So that means people that fish in the fishery that's right outside of their door, Bristol Bay, Kodiak, et cetera. You can see there's been a loss of almost 2,300 permits since 1980 from that sector, and this is the way the State Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission identifies permit holders. So the next slide, I think, is a quote from Norm Van Vactor, who's the CEO of the Bristol Bay CDQ group, and he makes the good point. He says, if these small businesses were manifested by storefronts, the ongoing closure and shuttering of storefronts year after year in our small local communities would be visually dramatic and have our citizens demanding change. But we don't see this visually because our boat harbors aren't emptying out. They're still full, but the ownership is changing. And with that, the economies, the local economies. So it's imperative that we address this issue. So that's sort of the trend and the issue that's happening in our state. And the two main systems, the State Limited Entry Act was enacted in 1973, and you can see it's intended to keep fishing rights in the hands of Alaskans dependent on fisheries. And then the other major privatization system in our state that impacts coastal Alaskans is on the next slide, the halibut IFQ program, which was adopted by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council in 1992. And you can see that the objectives of that program, we're not as focused on coastal community and fishermen's livelihoods. Different objectives there, but those are sort of the two that are really common in our coastal communities. So the next slide, the research questions that we're looking at include what are the barriers to entry and the upward mobility for young people? So this project is really looking at youth entry. And then how do these barriers differ by geographic, demographic, sociocultural variables? What factors influence young people's attitudes and participation in fisheries? Are there some successful pathways to establish ownership, and what kinds of public policy should the state consider to address the graying of the fleet? And the next slide illustrates where this project has taken place. So we've focused in the Bristol Bay region and the Kodiak region, and we've tried in both of those regions to have a mixture of the larger hub communities and some of the smaller outlying communities. And then in Bristol Bay, also included Kakanaak, which is a community that's upriver and is not part of the local CDQ in that region. And the methods that we used, you can just kind of click down through those for Melissa, are putting together the census data and the fisheries data to get a picture of what's going on. Then the PIs and the students did about 130 semi-structured interviews with current commercial fishermen, either older fishermen or younger people. And then we surveyed about 54% of all of the middle and high school students in all of those communities, and did a literature review. And the next slide is a photo of Danielle Ringer, who is one of our graduate students based in Kodiak, interviewing a fisherman. So you can see we did 70 interviews in Kodiak and 61 in the Bristol Bay region. And the next slide is just sort of a shot of what the survey is longer than this, but you can see the kinds of questions that we asked high school and middle school students. People look up to fishermen in this community. It's difficult for young people to become fishermen. Fishing is a great career, etc. So this project is at the point of analyzing some of the results, and so I'm going to put a few of those up here to just for you to look at. A few questions from the student survey. Are you currently working in commercial fishing? You can see Kodiak 4.3% yes, Bristol Bay 36.4% yes. Interested in getting involved, Kodiak 18, Bristol Bay 51. Family ties to commercial fishing, 24% Kodiak yes, 67% Bristol Bay. So some of the smaller communities outside of the hub of Kodiak City had a little bit higher percentages, but you can see it's kind of interesting that a community like Kodiak, which really is considered a fishing community, actually the high school and middle school students are less connected than the Bristol Bay students at this point. So, and then the next slide, I think just identifying what some of the barriers to entry that came both from the surveys and the interviews, and of course, I think as you would expect, the number one barrier that was identified was the high cost of getting in. Another one was lack of experience and lack of exposure to the field, lack of diversification opportunities, risk, and then community challenges. And one of the common community challenges that was mentioned by the high school and middle school students was social issues such as substance abuse, drugs and alcohol impacting the overall health and well-being of the communities. So just a few comments or quotes from folks that were interviewed. So bottom line, getting in is very expensive. This person said the costs are just astronomical when you're really young. Trying to secure loans that are $500,000 or more is just, nobody's going to just hand it over to an 18-year-old. And then the next slide, lack of experience and exposure to fishing. And I think these things sort of all compound each other, but certainly the second quote, I think a lot of youth would like to go fishing. They'd like to be part of it, but I see there being less opportunity just because your permit holders aren't there in the village. A lot of people have sold out. A lot of kids in the village here, and they're not experienced. You get to be, 16, 18 years old, and you have no experience. So that loss of permits leading to the loss of opportunity to have that kind of experience. And then a number of people commented on diversification, which is both the ability to fish in multiple fisheries, certainly a big issue in Kodiak. So if you want to fish halibut and salmon and other fisheries, herring or groundfish, there are costs involved with each one of these now, and so that makes it a little bit more difficult. And then in the Bristol Bay region, feeling like it's difficult to find other occupations that can supplement fishing but not prevent you from fishing. So this quote here, my captain's been wanting me to come down earlier and earlier, but I only get a month off. He's got to realize, and I don't think it clicks in his brain, but I have to work and I have obligations. I just can't go down there whenever he wants me to, And then a reflection by an older fisherman, it's hard to fish year-round and keep doing it. Can't work for yourself year-round as a young fisherman anymore. And then I think, of course, the risk barrier, the financial and operational, the volatility of markets and price, the volatility of the resource all lead to this sort of question, is this a viable way of life? And all of those things, I think, are compounded and seen as a barrier to getting into fishing by young people. So the flip side of that, the successful pathways are certainly when someone has family connections or other connections to gain exposure and experience, that is a successful pathway into the fishing industry. And then the same to provide support for capital to buy in. So either informally family members support the capital needed to get into the fishery, or maybe you have a skipper that you've worked for before that will go to the bank with you and vouch for your ability to take on that level of debt. Another successful pathway is to be able to find an occupation that's compatible with fishing, or a way to get into more than one fishery at a time. And then the fourth one that was mentioned was a number of times was financial literacy, understanding how to manage your money, how to manage large amounts of money that might come from fishing in a way that you can save and cover your taxes, and then also build up your business. So ultimately, I think, in terms of public policy considerations, I think it's important to recognize that this is a concern for the state, and then identify what those objectives are for our state. Is it to lower the average age of owners in our fishery? Is it to make sure that permits and access rights are available for coastal communities, and then develop the incentives that meet those objectives? So some of the possible alternatives that we have been looking at and identifying include ways to bring in capital so that you can afford to get into the fishery. But it's not the only piece by itself. Is there a good alternative to provide exposure and experience if you don't have those family connections? Maybe that's using the state's educational permits that are available and are virtually not used much at this point, or to develop an apprenticeship program, and then to consider some ways to adjust access opportunities. And in our state, we have something called super exclusive registration that's available. We have a legislator right now who's looking at setting up a community permit bank. a lot of what has happened, I think, in our state has been the result of the fact that you can, if you have access to fishing, you can buy it and sell it, and that has really elevated the cost and the value, and a lot of the results of that I've outlined here and the barriers have been created because of that system. So are there some alternative systems? And this is not by any means, if you go to the next slide, Melissa, that says global alternatives, this is a very universal problem of privatization and limiting access. And you can see, I'm not going to describe these, but you can see that Maine, Canada, Norway, New Zealand, Iceland, Newfoundland, and even the farm industry in our country has battled with this and looked at it. So we have some alternatives to analyze and put out for our state to consider. So just to conclude, I think ensuring a strong generation of fishermen is really a concern for the sustainability of coastal places, and these pathways to fisheries in Alaska have really been impacted by this market transfer of access. So if we can figure out a way to create access to finances, to family or other entry points, the ability to diversify and absorb risk, then I think we can impact that and start to turn that trend around. So how can we as a state create public policy that can support that? And I just wanted to mention in the next slide that one of the programs that we do in Sea Grant is the Alaska Young Fishermen Summit. It's been a really great event to support young fishermen, and especially with some of the financial literacy and some of the exposure that I've mentioned here. And so our next one will be in December in Anchorage. And and that's my final slide, is just the acknowledgments of all of the folks that allowed us to engage with them and be interviewed. So thank you.
All right.